Hello, everybody. Welcome to a British Audiophile. I'm delighted to say that I've got a very special guest here for my podcast this week, Ben from ATC. Hi, Ben.
Hi, Taron. How's it going?
Yes, good to see you. We had a little teething trouble trying to get this up and running because I'm a little bit new to this. So thank you for your help and assistance with that.
All right, thanks for having us.
Ben, you've been at ATC for a while, haven't you? Man and boy.
Yeah, I started here 18 years ago now. So I studied audio technology and acoustics at Salford University, which included a year in industry with a Finnish loudspeaker manufacturer, Genelec.
Right.
Worked in acoustic consultancy for about 6 months with Arup partners, and then started at ATC in 2003.
Right. Oh, wonderful. Yes, so great to have you here. Thanks for coming on. And ATC, I'm sure most people watching this probably know who ATC are. They're one of the most prestigious loudspeaker manufacturers in the world. They're known for their manufacturing loudspeakers for the hi-fi industry and for the pro audio industry, but obviously you make electronics as well. But ATC has been going for what, almost 50 years, is it?
Yeah, getting on that way. It's 74 the company was founded. So initially the company was founded to produce loudspeaker drive units, just the drive units. And we weren't making systems from the beginning, and that was in 1974. So the first range of drive units were 12-inch parts. They were used in a lot of the top performing live sound systems of the 70s and the 80s. So first came the 12, and that was followed by a 15 and then a 9-inch part. But around the same time, a couple of years later, and actually one of the reasons Billy Woodman, the company founder, left Goodman's where he started, was that he had the idea for the soft dome mid-range that we're so well known for throughout the world.
The famous 3-inch mid-range driver, is that right?
Yeah, that's the part, yeah. And Goodman at the time were going through some changes, and a lot of Billy's ideas were focused on higher quality, higher performance, lower volume, whilst Goodman's were going in the opposite direction. And Billy founded ATC to realize his ideas at the time. One of which is that soft dome mid-range that we're still producing today, and forms the sort of the backbone of our range of three-way speakers.
Do you still provide drivers for other manufacturers, or is it just you guys now? You're making your own speakers now.
We've pretty much all but withdrawn, just because it's basically how we're set up here. We don't have space and resources to do it anymore, and production's been extremely busy for the last 4 or 5 years, and it's just not viable really to produce components for other companies when production's so busy for our systems. So yeah, we still support the companies we supplied in the past, but it's they're not available to the majority of companies out there, and so we're just supporting the older stock now, rather than looking at that as a viable part of the business. Yeah.
And you're still doing a lot of stuff. I mean, obviously you're very well known for studios around the world, and that pro audio side, that's basically where it started from, was it really, the pro audio side?
Yes and no. I mean, I don't think Billy ever, when he began, I'm not sure if he ever thought we're going to be pro, we're going to be hi-fi. He just wanted to build a better loudspeaker. It just so happened that it worked. They worked well for both the hi-fi and the pro industry, and we're one of quite a few number of speaker companies, I think, who've managed to be successful in both areas. But yeah, Billy's never really had a philosophy of a speaker for pro or a speaker for hi-fi. He's always just focused on a high performance speaker, and if the engineering's right, and the speaker is balanced and accurate, and it's great resolution, we see no reason why that's going to be used in both fields really. The pro customers, for the bigger studios, the big rooms, they do demand a bigger, more powerful loudspeaker, but in terms other than that, I think and the hi-fi market obviously has a greater focus on aesthetics, but other than those two differentiators, really the core of the product is very, very similar.
Yeah, ATC, I've never produced a particular range or a particular tailored the sound pro or for hi-fis. It's always been the same sound for both, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, and it's I mean, and from an engineering standpoint, it certainly simplifies things. If you had to try and run the two different philosophies in parallel, it would be very, very difficult, really. And because ultimately it's an engineering focused philosophy, about how we achieve our goals. It'd be pretty much impossible, I think, to have two different sort of product lines that differed by much. So there's maybe small changes, but they're changes that are a result from a decision made for maybe the aesthetics or the shape of the cabinet, etc., that the hi-fi line demands or the pro product line demands. Then they happen as a result of other decisions rather than being a conscious decision to make the product sound a certain way.
The pro range look much more industrial, don't they? They and they have drivers sometimes in certain cabinet configurations which suit whatever application they're being used in the pro market, I suppose. But other than that, it's the same stuff inside.
Exactly. Yeah, most of our pro clients, I mean, there's always exceptions, but most of the pro clients, they are a tool to get a job done. They don't necessarily want to spend any more on the aesthetics. And in the big side-by-side dual base driver main monitors, for instance, they're sort of big, quite square kind of format. They wouldn't work very well in a home, but they work very well mounted in the wall, in the front wall of a control room.
Yeah, well, it's one of my favorite speakers, ATC. That's why I was keen to have you on here early on when I started this. So, like I say, I am very grateful for you coming. And I think some of the pro speakers in the past, or the perception has been within the hi-fi industry, that they're very detailed, but they tend to sound a little bit cold. That's never been ATC's sound, and I think that perception's changing. I don't know, is that something you still come across?
Yeah, I mean, there might be some other products out there that sound that way. But I mean, if you're designing a studio monitor, there would definitely be less concern about, or if we turn that around the other way, from looking at other products, there's definitely, if you look at hi-fi, there's definitely companies out there that tailor the sound to make it, sort of embellish a little bit, and then that's definitely the opposite, I would say, if you're a studio monitor manufacturer. But still, there are studio monitor manufacturers that that make products that sound a little warmer and those that are a little brighter. But I don't think that if you audition a dozen studio monitors, that the general consensus after listening to them all that they were all bright and overly detailed. It's definitely not how we've always done it. As I said before, it's always we've always focused on producing a product that's that's honest, low distortion, great clarity, and really that a lot of that comes from Billy's demand when he started the company. He's a piano player, and back in the 70s he could never really find a product that would really faithfully reproduce piano. So that was really what started it all. That's what drove the design of that mid-range dome, and that's really what underpins the range still today.
It's a difficult instrument to reproduce because it's such a large frequency range as well, and you can pick up fine timbral detail very, very easily, or the lack of, or any distortion in. So it's one of my
and very dynamic. You don't think of it being a loud instrument, but if you've got a grand piano, if you're stood next to it, it's a big, powerful instrument. I think a lot of people think of it being more subtle and pretty, but if you get a great player gets stuck into a grand piano, it's really, really dynamic and very loud, and that in combination with all of that harmonic content in the signal, a really fast attack, makes it really, really difficult to reproduce, and it's why it's such a great instrument for testing speakers.
Now I've got you here, I always wanted to pick your brain about certain aspects of loudspeaker design. So if you can indulge me for a moment or two, what's the most important thing? I mean, ATC obviously focus an awful lot of attention on the whole product, and the driver is a big part. Would I be right in saying, I mean, my view has always been that the driver is the most critical part. The drivers are the most critical part of a loudspeaker design. Is that the case?
I mean, it's difficult to single out one thing, and I think I think maybe the mistake that's made is trying to focus too heavily on one thing. I think the drive unit design and the performance does underpin it all, though, because so many of the decisions you make are based on the drive unit components. For instance, if we, you can't, if you need the speaker to be capable of a certain dynamic range, a certain sound pressure level, and a certain low frequency output, then that really will define. You can't say, okay, well, we need our speaker to go down to 30 or 40 hertz, and we want it to be really, really dynamic, but we want it to be a small two-way bookshelf. So many of the choices are defined by the performance of the components. So, the crossover point, if you think a 3K crossover point sounds good and you want to do a two-way speaker with an 8-inch bass driver, well, you're going to struggle, because getting the drive, that 8-inch mid bass driver to go to 3K is I'm going to say impossible, but you'll be left with a very narrow range of choices. So I think so many of the decisions you make are defined by the drive unit components. If you focus too heavily on just one thing, I think the performance will suffer. But if you held a gun to my head and said which parts is it, I think we'd have to say the components, the drive unit components, because so much of the character of the sound is defined by those transducers before you've done anything else. Of course, you can make a mess of the design further down the line, but if there are problems with the drive units themselves, it's pretty much impossible to engineer them out further down the line. And if you take that path, it's always going to be compromised. Whereas if you start with parts that work fantastically well, the rest of the design can be much simpler, more elegant, and it'll sound better as a result.
That's Bob. You can hear my dog scrambling in the background, so I'm not sure if
that's I have the ultimate podcast faux pas. My phone not being on silent.
He's decided that he's normally pretty chilled out, but he's decided, obviously, he's having his mad moment now. He's running around. We've got wood floors. You can hear him scampering everywhere. So apologies, everyone, if you're picking that up in the background. He obviously wants to make a guest appearance. So anyway, so the whole thing's important, but you have to start with the drive units and get those right first, and they're probably that's probably the starting point, isn't it, really, for a good loudspeaker?
Yeah, I mean, they are the principal sound source. The cabinet will contribute to that, and could color it, but it's still the if we look at cabinet resonances, for instance, just in a decent cabinet rather than a fantastically engineered cabinet, the cabinet resonances are going to be way down on the drive unit output. The crossover, of course, it affects the sound, but the decisions you make, especially with a passive crossovers are difficult, without having to deal with a drive unit that doesn't have a good response, a good behavior. So so many of the decisions come down to the choice of drive units made at the very beginning. So I think they probably are the most important element.
Yeah, that brings me nicely onto crossover. This is an area which I know we discussed it a little while ago when we spoke, where manufacturers seem to get criticized by a community, not a whole community, but an element of the community. They say, why are they still using sandcast resistors when there's, I don't want to get technical in this particular thing, when there's, metal film resistors, which are supposedly better, or why are they using iron? I don't think you do use iron core inductors. I think they mainly are air core, but some of the parts that go into crossovers, let's keep it simple as we can, get criticized because they look at the cost of the speaker, they look at the cost of the drivers, they can see the value in the cabinet, and they think, well, actually, some of the crossover parts, surely there's better crossover parts that you can put in. Does it make a difference? Is there any value in it? What's your view on that?
I mean, we haven't found that there's a big difference in the sound of the crossover components. There are particular things we pay a lot of attention to. We only use air cored inductors. Iron core inductors, that will saturate at higher power levels at lower frequency and produce distortion. It's a clear, quantifiable, measurable fact. We like metal film capacitors. very, very stable performance, low series resistance, really, really durable. And we use high power resistors, but we do use wire wound resistors. Now, some people criticize that they've got some inductance. Well, you can factor that into the design. If it's got a tiny amount of inductance, what's that's going to produce an effect at at 150k? Well, there's hardly any content in audio, and the tweeter has no response. And you can also take account for it within the design. If there's some small amount of capacitance between tracks, we can model it, we can include it in the design, and as a result, perhaps we can use a slightly smaller capacitor. Or if there's a contribution from a resistor network, well, it's measurable, it's quantifiable, and you can account for it elsewhere. I think fitting upgraded components is an easy thing. It's just an easy thing to do. It's seen as an easy upgrade. I think that's why it gets tinkered with. It's a lot easier than working on new cone geometry, new cone construction, finite element analysis on a rubber surround, for instance. So I think there is an element of the ease of component upgrading that contributes to its popularity.
Great.
But for us, the crossover is the largest part of its contribution to the sound of the product is the choice of values of components. Of course, the type of component does contribute to it, but again, it's if you were to make a list of priorities, if you fixed everything else up above it, and there is a long list of things to fix before you start looking at the type of components, perhaps you look at them then. But if you're worried about this, you're looking at these levels of detail, then I don't know why you wouldn't just use an active loudspeaker anyway.
Yeah.
There is an element of of polishing the turd.
Yes. Okay. Well said. I'm glad you said it rather than me. So that brings me nicely onto the active passive thing. Obviously, for those viewers out there who active loudspeakers are where you've got an electronic crossover rather than electric crossover. So I'll just explain briefly. I think most people probably know, but there is some confusion between powered speakers and active, which I think isn't helped by the fact that a lot of manufacturers who produce powered speakers brand them as active, and it's not necessarily to do with having amplification built into the loudspeaker. It's to do with how the crossover works and where it sits in the signal path. So Ben, correct me if any of this.
There's also, I think there's also a little bit of difference between the United States and Europe as well. Where I think the US powered is more commonly used, but for ATC we've got passive loudspeakers, in which there are no active electronics included within the loudspeaker system. The signal flow is amplifier, passive crossover network, which splits the audio into however many bands, which is sent to however many drive units to reproduce the bass, mid, and the treble, or the bass, the mid, and the treble. We view a powered speaker as a passive loudspeaker, but with a power amplifier in the box. So the signal flow is still exactly the same for a passive, but we just have an amplifier integrated into the cabinet. The only performance benefit with a powered design is convenience, tidiness. More integrated, and the fact that you get rid of, you minimize the loudspeaker cable run to the shortest possible path length. Those are the only two real advantages it offers. An active loudspeaker has an entirely different signal flow. You have multiple power amplifiers, what the number of which is generally matched to the number of bands the speaker works over, either 2 in a 2-way, 3 in a 3-way. And the power amplifier is connected, directly coupled to the loudspeaker drive unit after the active crossover network. And the crossover is executed using active electronics, generally op amps, filter circuits. And so there's no major difference, and hopefully that sort of clarifies.
There's definitely there's definitely a technical benefit from what I understand. There's a bunch of them, but Bob's going crazy. Sorry. there's a bunch of them from the fact that the signal's broken up at low level, so there's less signal losses going through when you're breaking up at low level rather than after the power amplifier. There's less phase shifts, there's direct coupling, so you've got a power amplifier that's coupled directly to each driver, like you mentioned, so the damping factor is better, there's much better control and grip, and a bunch of others. You can go on about the technical benefits. And when I listen to the ATC SCM 19 passives, because you're kind enough to send me the passives and the actives at the same time, and I did an A/B comparison, even no matter what amplifier I put on it, even my exposure amplifiers, which I think, I can, obviously it's a different sound. The benefit with the passive is you can tailor the sound to a certain extent to what you want, whereas with active you've got the sound that the manufacturer's decided. But in terms of the technical performance, the clarity, the grip, the control, there was I wouldn't say night and day difference, but there was a marked difference between the two.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the active approach gets you around a large number of issues. Generally with the passive crossover, it's in the passive, as you said, the passive crossover, especially the bass section. There's quite a lot of loss in the bass section. To create a low pass filter, we have to have some series resistance in the inductor, which filters off the higher frequencies of the bass driver. That reduces efficiency and absorbs energy and leads to that slightly less control of the bass driver you mentioned. And with the active electronics, we can create a more stably timed circuit. We can account for any phase shifts by putting an all-pass filter in there, so the speaker output's more coherent. And another major benefit is that the crossover performance doesn't change with level. So the passive crossover is connected to the drive units, and the drive unit has a nominal impedance, but it actually varies dynamically, and it also varies with frequency. So a passive crossover network, when it's operating at low levels, where it may work very, very well, but if we then double, triple, quadruple the amount of power that's going into the speaker, voice coil gets hot, and then it slowly creeps up, and an 8 ohm may become a 9 or a 10 ohm. Speaker, and then the actual performance of the passive crossover changes, and that's something that's varying dynamically as the speaker's playing, depending on the level the speaker's being used at and the type of music that's being sent. So it'll always, the active system is always going to sound more balanced over a wide range of listening levels than the passive, and generally, if well engineered, always better integration between the drive units.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you've still got the preamplifier and the source side to be able to tailor the sound to some extent. The only thing I found is definitely more detailed, much better grip, much better control. But I did find that the active system sounded, I won't use the word forward, it wasn't forward, because that gives a different, but it sounded much more direct. And sometimes I preferred a slightly more relaxed presentation with certain tracks. Is that fair to say?
There's some more aggressive sounding recordings. Sometimes the passive system maybe just rounds those edges off just a little bit. So subjectively, they may sound better. But if we're talking about how accurate a speaker is, a well-engineered active model is always going to outperform its passive equivalent, and that's our focus. And that's why we've got such a strong belief in them. But if you wanted something that was maybe a little bit mellower, then the passive it could be the way to go. And we manufacture both, and both get an equal billing. We're passionate about active design simply because we've got a strong belief in them having better performance. But we appreciate that there's a lot of people out there that enjoy matching, selecting components, selecting their power amplifiers. They've invested a lot of time and effort into selecting their components, and and ATC's passive speakers are amongst the best available. So there's no reason they shouldn't choose them and use them within their systems. Yeah,
and there are some cracking amplifiers that you can stick on the end of the passive speakers to get very close to the technical performance as well. I think if it might cost you a little bit more money than you're not, but you can probably get one really good stereo amplifier or a series of mono blocks and get close perhaps, and like you say, you have a little bit more flexibility. So horses for courses, I suppose.
Exactly. Exactly. But ultimately you will reach that point, I think, with a passive system whereby the greatest amplifier in the world, whatever that is always going to be slightly held back by the passive crossover network that sits between it and the drive units. You know, if that amplifier was after an active crossover network, you know, driving that bass driver directly, then you would really start to realize what it was actually capable of. So it's almost like it will be slightly held back by the performance of the passive network.
Would you ever have any, do you have any plans or have been thought about in the time that maybe to have a way of people who have the passives or have some kind of where they can, you can have the active module, so perhaps, you know, like the active crossover in a separate box, and they can choose their own amplifiers. You've got, and they bought the, so what I'm saying is they bought the passive speaker. There's something where they can basically bypass the crossover, buy an active crossover from yourselves in a box, and then use whatever amplification. I remember when I got into this hobby, it's probably fairly early on, so it must have been late 80s, early 90s. Name and Lin systems were all about active at the time, and it seems to have disappeared. But they used to have these separate boxes, and I think even Exposure did it for a time. Is that something that ATC ever explored or thought was worthwhile?
Way back at the very beginning, we made an active crossover network before we made amplifiers. So the earlier big active ATC systems used an ATC active crossover, and then if it was in a studio, they probably use C audio or quad power amplifiers. So that we had that system way back. I think the difficulty comes in supporting it and guaranteeing the performance of a system, you know, in that way. Because the speaker with any active ATC, and the final stage of QC here at the factory is that the speaker is calibrated, you know, the amplifier is calibrated for the drive units in the speaker in question. And that's one advantage of active, is that we can tailor it each and every active speaker that leaves the factory, make some very small adjustments, typically plus or minus quarter, plus or minus half a dB gain adjustment to optimize the frequency response for the particular drive units in that cabinet. So doing the external crossover using any amplifier, there's quite that process, you know, unless the dealers and distributors are in a position to complete that calibration, which they could do, complicated perhaps by, you know, environment and a space they've got to do that test within, you know, and technical knowledge, yeah, that they could do that. But, you know, where do you make it available to any amplifier? Do you restrict it to, you know, to a certain range of amplifiers you approve? It's, you know, it's certainly possible, but it's not especially straightforward. And I think guaranteeing performance is something that we might, you know, we might worry about. I mean, some of our products at the moment, both the cabinets are the same for active and passive. So for instance, 20 towers, 50s in classic and tower format, 100s in classic and tower format, and 150s in classic and tower format. They can run active or passive. So someone can buy those in passive form, and if after 4 or 5 years they wanted to go active, they can return them to us in the if they're in the UK. We can install the active modules, calibrate the speakers, and then they can be returned to them. A small handful of our distributors is going to offer that service as well, but not everyone's got the test and measurement capabilities to calibrate the speakers and ensure factory performance.
I think the other thing is also, especially with the tweeter, the passive crossover protects the driver. So the potential is for someone to mess around with it when you've got nothing between it. Sticking a 100-watt amplifier on the end of your tweeter and then watching that go up in smoke might not be that much fun. I
think that's an issue we had in the early days when, you know, effectively any amplifier could be used. You know, there were issues in the 70s. You know, the transistor amps of the day weren't as stable and reliable as they are now, and there were a lot of drive units toasted by amplifier issues. And I know that was one reason why we developed our own range of, you know, of amplifiers, power amplifiers, standalone, and the active amp packs that now drive our speakers, because we can, you know, it's a known quantity and we can guarantee performance.
Yeah, no, I think it's just, I was probably looking at it probably selfishly from my own point of view. I'd probably be that niche customer that'd sit there and think, oh, you know, that ATC SCM7, oh, imagine that with a little active crossover, and then choose, even if there was just because obviously the issue with that, I think we discussed this before, is to make an active version of that, the box would have to be so much bigger. It would be
it'd be pretty much, when using our amplifier technology now, I mean, the amplifier would be sort of, if we take the SCM7, that's the toughest challenge. The amplifier pack for that would be, to give it this, 100, you probably want 100 watts driving the bass minimum, probably end up with about 25 or 30 on the tweeter. And we prefer class AB designs. The amplifier would be sort of add 50% to the size of the cabinet, and so suddenly then it becomes quite a bulky speaker.
Well, I'm hoping to look next year and have a look at the 40s at some point, because I've heard them many times. I'm mightily impressed, and you're getting close to most people's end game speaker with the active 40s. I think.
The 40s, both passive and active form. I was actually talking to a UK retailer about them yesterday. They're not we make better performing speakers. All the speakers above it, the 50, the 100, the 150, have got better performance. But it is a personal favourite. I think they've just got that, a lot of things just right. They're big enough that they can, they've got the scale to really do, full orchestral recording justice, and really good low frequency extension. But they're not so big that they're a difficult fit into many people's rooms. They just offer fantastic value for money.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a big
which isn't a focus for it seems for many manufacturers these days.
It's when we go from the 40 to the 50, there's a fair jump up in price, and it's justified. I mean, there's a much better tweeter. There's a superior crossover. There's especially if you're looking at the actives, there's more power, isn't there, as well? I think, isn't that right?
Yeah,
and they can play
much wider range of cabinet finishes as well. So once you get up to the 50, everything's built to order. So there's an economy of scale, big difference to the economy of scale there, which is one reason why you're restricting the finishes we do on the smaller range from the 7 through to the 40 active. That's why we can offer those at a much more competitive price point. Yeah, I'm not going to say cheap, because they're certainly not cheap, but we're confident they offer excellent value for money.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to checking those out. So with the 50th anniversary coming, anything you can tell me?
No,
anything planned?
No, hey? I'm not going to say nothing. I'm not going to say there's nothing planned, but there's nothing I can talk about.
Nothing you can tell me. No, there's a surprise. There's a big surprise. Yeah, no, great. Well, I don't know how long we've been on, so I think I think that pretty much covers what I wanted to say this time. I'm sure I'd love to have you. Well, I would love to have you on at another time, and perhaps I wanted to keep this relatively kind of tech-free for a change. We could probably drill down into some of these topics around drivers and all the other stuff.
Yeah, totally. It's nice to try and give it wide appeal. I think. A lot of the selling points of our products are in the technology, but I don't want to make it I want to try and make it accessible as possible to everyone.
Oh, we could do a whole episode on just the driver tech in terms of the magnet structures and the materials that are used, and the way that in the 19 the mid-range decouples itself from the woofer. So there's a lot of innovation. It's a very engineering-led company that that sets some very high standards, especially when it comes to the drivers and how they perform. And your SCM19 woofer, that thing weighs 9 kgs. That's about the same weight as the entire speaker, competitor speakers. I know I have to pick them up when they arrive.
Yeah, that comes from the short coil, long gap design. So when you've got a 20 millimeter gap, 20 millimeter top plate to give you lots of linear excursion, then the magnet assembly grows and gets very, very bulky and very heavy very quickly. I mean, that could be offset by using a neodymium structure, but as our speakers aren't they're not designed to be portable and moved around. It's not a big deal, except for
magnet.
Yeah, except for reviewers who have to move them around day in, day out.
Yeah, well, I'd love to get into that at some point. But Ben, I'd thank you for coming on. Really appreciate it.
All right, no trouble. Yeah, thanks for taking the time, Taryn. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.